Welcome to Deleted Saves. On this episode, Dance of the Dead, my extremely brief time with the Dead Rising series. Man, Capcom sure does love their zombie games, don't they? While I hesitate to label the company the masters of zombie-themed survival horror media, they certainly led the pack when it comes to representing the shambling, moldering horde. I've long been a fan of the Resident Evil series, a fact I'm sure I've beaten into the ears of longtime listeners by now. And I have tried my hand at many of their other Resident Evil but blank instead of zombies franchises. Yet today's topic, the Dead Rising franchise, was one where they inverted the formula a bit. Instead of having the main character run for their life across a city or mansion or rural countryside village, a staple of those biohazardous games by now, Capcom set the action of these games across locations of suburban excess, the shopping megamall, and Las Vegas-style Desert City. Of course, what they could not get away from was the idea that the inciting incident, what makes these zombies, is some sort of biochemical engineering scheme utilized as an act of revenge against an unsuspecting public. Knowing why the dead have risen in this sort of media is actually usually a bad thing. In the original George Romero Dead trilogy, it was certainly hinted at. An astrological event, hell itself having filled the capacity, among other ideas. But you, as the viewer, were never supposed to know exactly how or why, as it ruins the horror. You were just supposed to understand that the undead were a force of nature and that humanity was the real monster. First racism, then empty capitalist consumerism, and then lack of communication and understanding or empathy, in that order of the films. However, as we now reside in a world where media literacy is deader than the on-screen monsters, subsequent creators have all tried to hand-wave where the end of the world came from and what it could mean, and more focus on the gleeful gore of watching asshole stereotypes being literally ripped apart on celluloid. Sure, this can stem from a better scientific understanding of the world. Rather than seeing societal collapse from natural disaster as an act of an angry god or lack of moral certainty, as it was commonly seen until the dawn of the 20th century, the Enlightenment be damned, we now have science to explain where events like this come from, assuming, of course, you don't have a large swath of humans either burying their heads in the sand or denying obvious scientific facts to better fit a personal, economically based philosophical and religious narrative. Even the remakes of Romero's Dead films did that, and they have suffered for it. And it is here that the Dead Rising games get their fertile grounds upon which to root themselves. Specifically, and as it was talked about in games media when the first Dead Rising game debuted, was the connection between the game and the second of the Dead films, George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, a 1978 film taking place in Pennsylvania, which centers around four characters: a radio operator and his girlfriend, and two renegade SWAT officers, the latter of whom had been involved in a massive raid on a black community, the overtones of which were racially motivated, during an outbreak of the Walking Dead, and the four flee by helicopter to a local abandoned shopping mall, where they will make their last stand against the horde. Hijinks ensue as the four try to live normal lives while raiding the mall for supplies and staking out their own little territories while avoiding the zombies, often killing them in amusing manners, or watching the creatures that were once human wander sadly about, reliving their lives of consumerism out of little more than instinct. This was Romero himself railing against a society he saw as drowning in its own excess in an attempt to be comfortable, to avoid the social, economic, and political changes and villainy going on around them, and instead focus on the vain and the venal, instead of change, and that actually goddamn doing something about the corruption around you requires sacrifice and discomfort. And let's be honest, nobody, especially not white middle class people, wants that. You know, the post age 30 plus motherfucker interested in his green lawn and the Prius in his driveway, then doing the real thing, more than so. With friend groups that discuss fitness, golf swings, and fiduciary gains as sovereign gospel and the new age moral certainty of our time. And yes, Romero hid that not so blatantly in a movie about the mindless dead eating the living. Now, as you can guess, this isn't a film class. I'm not here to give an in-depth review of Dawn of the Dead or talk about its themes at length. I'm just paraphrasing what a lot of film critics and analysts who do know more than I do about movies to help make my point. I'm here to talk about video games that ape its style. If I said something in the last minute that you did not like or are uncomfortable with or wish to actually me on, may I suggest you go stick your head in a bathtub full of used, aging e-girl bathwater and breathe deeply. Or perhaps maybe stop being a fucking asshole and check yourself. In any case, Dead Rising isn't that deep. It certainly takes the skin of that film and uses it to be a gleeful action title where you smash zombies over the head with coffee makers and widescreen TVs for a body count, while making a bit of ham-fisted social commentary. But we'll get to that. Dead Rising, in its original form, debuted on the Xbox 360 in 2006, and it is not listed as a horror game despite its trappings. It is instead an action-adventure game known for its absolute mass of enemies able to appear on screen at once, and its hard-to-read text. The game itself is set in Willamette, Colorado, far from its western Pennsylvania origins, and is set inside the impossibly sprawling Willamette Mall, modeled after the Minnesotan Mall of America, a complex worthy of the devil Mammon himself that encompasses multiple restaurants, multitudes of copy and paste stores, a theme park, water park, and an army of service workers making the machine run. The Willamette Mall is very similar, and many clothes stores, antique stores, food depots, hardware stores, a grocery, movieplex, roller coaster, and a maze of the substructure you will be exploring along the way as part of it. It is even quipped in-game as the only reason to ever visit Willamette, which is otherwise another several square miles of rural flyover country in the American West. Our, and I use this term loosely, hero for this game is Frank West, so full of his own bullshit his eyes are brown, bumbling photojournalist who would be right at home working for Vox, Vice Media, or BuzzFeed. He has come to Willamette following up on leads that, for unknown reasons, the U.S. military has closed the town off and aren't allowing anyone in or out. Paying off a local mercenary commercial helicopter pilot, Frank begins the game doing by flyover over the town, capturing on his camera what is going on. The townsfolk seemingly having gone berserk, walking into fires and exploding gas stations, ripping their fellow citizens apart with their bare hands, and feasting on them, taking glamour shots of desperate people leaping to their deaths from rooftops rather than face hordes stalking them, and armed survivors making desperate last stands in parking lots and from car roofs. All the while, the pilot hoots and hollers like it's a day at the rodeo, and topless strippers are entertaining the crowd between rides. There are two main mechanics in this title: combat experience and photographic experience, both of which filter into Frank's ability to gain more health, inventory space, and combat maneuvers as the game goes on. Dead Rising is meant to be an exploitive as you play. The more sexual, gory, or dramatic the photo Frank can capture among the devastation, the more points he gets. And of course, the more heads he can chop off along the way also helps. Reaching the mall complex itself, a wave of black government helicopters begin to chase the smaller commercial one, and the pilot tells Frank he'll be back in exactly 3 days to pick him up. Otherwise, he'll leave Frank to his fate. Frank leaps from the roof to the roof of the mall, spraining his ankle along the way, and the pilot speeds off to evade being shot down by the government. Recovering, it is here that Frank will meet one of the recurring characters of the game, Carlito, an out-of-place dude with a Spanish accent, who less than warmly welcomes Frank to the mall and the mayhem, and upon seeing Frank's camera, encourages him to document everything. Once under player control, the game's next mechanics start. An unstoppable 72-hour clock that will dictate every one of Frank's movements, interactions, and investigations throughout the game. Inside the mall's service areas, he finds the master control area of the mall being run by Otis, the head janitor of the Willamette Mall, who is monitoring the closed-circuit TV cameras. Seeing Frank's his way out, he gives Frank a walkie-talkie and asks him to save as many of the people as he can who are trapped in the mall when the dead attacked. At first, Frank is skeptical, but when he emerges into the mall and sees survivors barricading the doors and members of Homeland Security trying to lead them, as well as the rotting dead at the doors, well, he begins to become less skeptical. It is here that he will meet three more important characters: Isabella, who, like Carlito, is a fish out of water; Brad, the DHS agent; and Russell Barnaby, who is locked in a separate area of the mall and whom Brad is looking for. I won't talk too much about the walking pair of boobs, who is the other DHS agent, back in the safe house. Now, she does almost nothing other than be eye candy cleavage in a tweed jacket, who eventually becomes a zombie. Frank is taking it all in. An upset old woman sees her poodle just chilling in the doorway with the undead and pulls the barricade on the door to let the dog and the dead in, and we get the final mechanic: the fast-paced and frantic combat and running away mechanics, where the player can pick up literally anything not nailed down and use it as a weapon to stave off the zombies. Items like benches, TVs, trash cans, and just about anything else. Once back in the central control area, Frank will be recruited by Brad to help figure out how to convince Barnaby to come out of hiding, save who you can, and figure out how this whole mess started. All within the in-game 72 hours. From this point, the player has choices to make: save people, try to follow the investigation leads, or just try to get as many photos as possible and get your own self out alive. The correct path is the second option, in which you'll need to follow a strict time between investigations, many of which times overlap, to reach the real ending. I'll tell you right now, if you miss even one of them, the story is pretty much over and you'll spend the remaining time in the game clock running around and killing zombies until the end of the game, where you'll have to get out in the helicopter. But assuming you actually follow the investigations, this is the story you will uncover. After you and Brad are attacked by a machine gun wielding Carlito in the food court, you will discover that Isabella is Carlito's sister, and she is here unwillingly. Russell Barnaby was a government scientist working for years in Central America, and that the village of San Cabeza was an American research facility working on cattle. A breed of cattle, in fact, meant to be fast growing and fast reproducing to cover the food needs of the U.S. citizens and their desire for beef, and the corporate meat companies needing an infinite supply. The results of the research was a type of bee that creates a larva that infects humans and turns them into mindless, endlessly hungry, rotting undead. Carlito was a citizen researcher of that town and watched his home being destroyed by this plague, and then having the U.S. government and his home country cover it up. And he brings the plague to an American megamall to unleash it on what he feels is a greedy and culpable American public. How does Carlito make this world-class leap in logic? Well, the same way many foreign agents make it in the real world. They assume that our government tells us, step by step, absolutely everything they are doing to both us and the people worldwide, and that we all agree to it. What our allies and enemies do not realize is that the government and corporations lie to us just as much, if not more, than they do to you. The difference is that most U.S. citizens don't care, or are so beaten down, tired, brainwashed, and frankly afraid of their government and fellow citizens that they don't care beyond holding down the little fortifications of their own lives. Fear rules us in truth, no matter who is in the White House or at the CEO desk. Just in case it wasn't clear, yes, I'm calling out my fellow citizens here. But after Carlito shows his hand, his sister Isabella reveals at first that she was all for this plan, until she saw what the plague actually does, and she changed her mind, and reveals to Frank that there is a possible cure. It is at this point the 72 hours is up, and Otis is able to get all the survivors she picked up out of the mall. Frank's pilot, however, is killed when a zombie sneaks aboard the helicopter and eats the pilot mid-flight, and the chopper crashes, leaving Frank stranded and now infected, as the dead and the military close in. All alone now except for Isabella, with an additional 24 hours at best to live, and most of the other main characters having been killed by now, Frank must fight the undead and the army as he tries to save Isabella and get out alive, culminating in a fist fight with an army general, and a now nearly naked Frank, atop an M1 Abrams tank. Dead Rising ends so fucking absurdly that it pretty much destroys any attempt at making its ham-fisted social commentary. See, I told you I'd be bringing that back around and getting that commentary to land. What is that social commentary? In case you rushed past it in the chaos of the gameplay, it is that America's inherent greed to fill, as Carlito puts it, our fat American bellies is harming the rest of the world, and we deserve to be punished. That is an argument that has been lobbed as derision against the US for decades. What I think our allies and enemies around the world fail to realize is that we have been all fed upon the American diet, no matter where we are in this country, which is all about resource theft and ultra-processed foods filled with corn syrup and red dye to make it more appealing and add to the capitalist profit margins by supplanting actual nutritional ingredients with cut-rate crap so that we can be charged more for much less. Healthcare remains well beyond the scope of what most Americans can access, and food deserts pop up left and right when major corporate grocery chains decide certain ethnic or culturally diverse areas, meaning poor, of cities and towns no longer prove profitable. And among this American outlook is the need for shortcuts to health, meaning shortcuts to weight loss such as Ozempic, and how the multi-million-dollar per year exercise industry has become less about health and more about Instagram performance pieces and unhealthy influencers and bullying and body shaming through pictures of idealized people, among other things. Yes, greed in American consumerist culture is inherently destructive and is harming both ourselves and people around the world. And while I can absolutely agree to the harm it does and that it needs to stop, none of it will ever stop without massive social and economic change we simply are not and never going to be ready for or accepting of. And it is at this point where, with that understanding, we see Carlito's argument fall apart. Sure, the writers in 2006 couldn't have foreseen the developments we would have in these fields in 2025, but its roots are there. But the whole crux of the murder plot, the destruction of America by turning its weapons against it, is undone within the very speech it was given, and is little more than a short-term victory without Carlito having this context, especially when aimed at a nation built around the idea of utterly destroying those who can even possibly threaten its bottom line. And that is the main disconnect I have with Dead Rising. Yep, it is a fun as fuck game where you can mindlessly slaughter former citizens with anything in the mall that you can lay your hands on. Have quote unquote boss fights with mentally ill people and weirdos forced to the breaking point under the strain of the infection. The cult in the movie theater and the Vietnam veteran in the hardware store are some of the wildest that come to mind. And playing dress up. But if you don't want to interact with the really kind of bullshit story more reminiscent of Return of the Living Dead than Dawn of the Dead, then you will miss the entirety of what this game has to say. Then it just becomes a morality play about whether Frank will show altruism in trying to rescue as many survivors as possible. And since the original game's AI for NPCs was notoriously awful and would walk survivors right into hordes of zombies, all the while screaming for help, this is quite difficult. Or will Frank refuse to help anyone, or go so far as to use the survivors as bait to achieve whatever goal the player sets for him? And at its heart, Dead Rising is a deeply political game. Yes, I know there's a vocal minority in games that feels all games should be seen as apolitical and that anything even hinting at the discomfort felt by others at the hands of the majority white culture needs to be torn down as woke. But look, the inciting incident is done for reasons of geopolitics and capitalism, however questionably written. And I'm not saying it is Metal Gear Solid levels of political, but should you choose not to interact with it by following the story, then there's very little point to this game even existing outside of a weird hybrid role-playing game slash brawler, a style of game Capcom used to be quite good at. I'm not saying Dead Rising is a bad game in that state. It is just a very pointless game in that state without its political roots. But even following that main plot is difficult because often getting to the goals on time is frustrating, and depending on how good or bad you are at the photo mechanic in the game, you may not even be able to use that effectively to your benefit. and the photojournalist portion may just hang there like an infected appendix needing to be surgically removed. So to sum up Dead Rising, it is a brawler hybrid where you, as the player, pilot one of the dumbest motherfuckers in recent gaming history as he karate chops and comedy photographs zombies while bumbling through the post traumatic stress disorder of a foreign national here to destroy the U.S. military industrial complex capitalist state by turning all of its citizens into the ultimate eating machines they already always were. True consumers in the most basic and brutalist sense. And all for our entertainment. There is a lot to be said. But I know that that's not why this game was so well regarded for its time, and that's not what it is remembered for. And I wouldn't have thought, back in 2006, that would have been all we would need to say. And this would have been a dead end series, another strange Capcom one off title. And yet, Dead Rising would get a sequel, and then a franchise. Dead Rising 2 landed on consoles in 2010, and the game moved the metaplot further along the board in its natural evolution of human experiences of disasters and crises, from accepting an ongoing disaster as normal to learning how to profit from it for entertainment and corporate greed. 5 years after the events of Willamette, Colorado, which canonically Frank West survives, our focus instead turns to Chuck Green, former motocross star with a passing resemblance to the actor Thomas Jane, who is down and out after losing his wife to a zombie outbreak in Las Vegas, and during the same disaster having his young daughter get infected by the zombie plague. Chuck is now almost completely bankrupt from buying Zombrex, the immunosuppressant drug that must be administered every 12 hours, or those infected by the same zombie plague of the first game will turn to full-fledged zombies, and he has made its parent-owning company fabulously wealthy as a life-saving necessity in this new post-pandemic world. Chuck is in Fortune City to star on an episode of Terror is Reality, a controversial but popular game show where contestants gamble their lives to slay zombies for money and prizes, similar to the old game Smash TV, which itself was based on Stephen King's book and later Arnold Schwarzenegger's movie, The Running Man. And this is how we start this game. Chuck on a motorcycle, revving chainsaws attached to the thing, slicing his way through former average citizens whose only crime was being at the wrong place at the wrong time when they were bitten, and now being too poor to afford a placebo. Zombies are now commonplace, so Americans and the companies that control the economy of daily life are using them for entertainment. No issue here, right? My goodness, dear listeners, where have we seen this before? Chuck survives his time in the tank and collects his winnings, including a lot of Zombrex, just in time to give a dose to his daughter who is waiting in the green room. But out of nowhere, someone unleashes the zombies waiting for the next recording session into the city, framing Chuck in the process, and soon Fortune City falls to a new outbreak. This game is not really focused on trying to help survivors as you were in the first game, though you will meet a few. And you will certainly meet the new breed of psychopaths for their boss battles. But the real big mechanic of Dead Rising 2 is Chuck's ability to cobble together custom weapons in a hurry using various recipe cards at workbenches scattered throughout the game. Weapons such as the spiked bat, a baseball bat studded with nails, electrified boxing gloves using boxing gloves and a Blanca mask from Street Fighter 2, good cross-branding marketing there, Capcom, a hand grenade taped to a football, and of course 2 chainsaws duct taped to a kayak paddle. These weapons do double damage and even add more to Chuck's experience meter, where he gains more health, inventory, and special attacks, much like Frank West randomly did in the first game. However, while the investigation in the game follows a much more set path and are more likely for the player to successfully follow, the real race against the 72-hour clock in this game is to make sure you get back to the safe house in time with enough Zombrex to administer to Katie, Chuck's daughter. Should you fail to do that, it's really game over. The plot of Dead Rising 2 is more anti-corporate than the political atmosphere of the previous game. The host of Terror's Reality, a pimp of the old school named Tyrone T.K. King, and holy fuck, is this guy a stereotype and a half, is using the chaos to improbably rob all the casinos in Fortune City at once. But even when his end goal is revealed halfway through the game, TK reveals to Chuck that he was framed at the behest of an even more powerful force, that of Phenotrans, the pharmaceutical company solely responsible for making the Zombrex anti-zombification drug. One of their agents let the zombies out. I would think that something as dangerous to the overall health of the populace, like, say, a literal plague of the walking dead, would preclude any one company from claiming a sole government patent on a life-saving drug. But as we've seen with insulin, for example, saving lives really never trumps corporate profits, with potential billions of dollars on the line. With his righteous dad fury focused now on the new threat posed by Phenotrans, things go from bad to worse as the sands of the hourglass filter down to the last hours, and the military shows up to help get survivors out of Fortune City, as now 5 years on they have been battle-hardened against outbreaks. When suddenly Phenotrans pulls the rug out from under humanity by unleashing a green gas that causes all the zombies to mutate out of control and slaughter the entire military battalion. It would be another 24 hours before the next battalion could reach the city, but the government decides to firebomb the whole place and cleanse it and make sure the outbreak stops. Similar to the way the ending of Resident Evil 3 and the federal government passing judgment on Raccoon City in that game to disrupt a greater loss of life occurs. Capcom and guest developer Blue Castle Games retread familiar ground here. Chuck is desperate to let the larger world know the truth of what happened, and when he and his allies are just about to get a satellite phone call out to the larger world, his friends and contacts are killed by said Phenotrans agent, who tries to escape with the evidence. Chuck pursues the agent on a motorcycle, gets into a rooftop fight, and kills the agent, and still manages to get the word out to the press of Phenotrans' involvement, if of course the press corps can send rescue helicopters to the survivors. This is where the game at last ends, in one of two ways. If you gave Zombrex to TK or not. If not, he turns and Chuck must sacrifice himself to save the survivors. If you gave him a shot of the stuff, then Chuck and TK must brawl as TK tries to take over the helicopter for himself and kill everyone. So either way, TK has to die for the end of the game. And maybe Chuck will join him in the great beyond. By comparison, Dead Rising had at least 6 variants, probably more as I don't recall them all, of the ending. Whether Blue Castle planned for more and ran out of time in development, or this ending option is just what they wanted, I am unaware, but frankly, it hardly matters. Notice I kind of rushed through the story of Dead Rising 2 as opposed to Dead Rising. That's because the sequel is unfortunately quite forgettable. Chuck isn't really a compelling character, other than being an angry dad trying to keep a sick little girl alive. Same as any other angry dad stereotype. The kid is even more annoying than endearing, and this hybrid corporations are really bad / inept Ocean's 11 bank heist plot is a hot fucking mess. We already know what the science behind the zombies is, which ruins the mystery. And the fact that periodic outbreaks happen like school shootings, with the public just sort of shrugging it off in response, just goes nowhere. Dead Rising 2 plays out like a 10 to 15 hour long version of the short prop headline satirical news outlet The Onion reprints and updates whenever a mass shooting occurs, which reads, "No way to prevent this," says only nation where this happens regularly. The people who believe that zombie outbreaks just happen now, common as trips to the coffee shop, when common fucking sense would dictate otherwise. Much like the previous game, Dead Rising 2 is a fun slaughter brawler where you battle through the glitz of a Las Vegas as if you ordered it from Wish.com, where you can occasionally put together dumb toys with grit, spit, and duct tape until they break. And boy howdy, do they try to shoehorn in Chuck's days as a motocross champ. But if you get hot under the collar by me saying the previous game was pointless without its political plot, then Dead Rising 2 is still pointless even with its anti-corpo plot. There really is no reason for the sequel to exist other than to make money from a brand. which is very pro-corporate, in fact. I'm sure someone out there is mad that I said that, but I'm still correct. But if it makes you feel better, I do realize that this is somebody's favorite game, so I'm happy for you. I got rid of this turkey as soon as I could once I beat it. But in truth, there is still some value to the plot of Dead Rising 2, even if it is a poor sequel. As I said at the beginning of this section, the plot has evolved to reflect the state of the human psyche when confronted with a possible apocalyptic disaster there is no way to recover from. Normalize, laugh at it, hope you don't catch the ick, and see if there is a way to make a little nest egg profit of the suffering of others. Again, the writers in 2010 could have no way have seen what would happen in 2020. But in a small way, Dead Rising 2 seems oddly prophetic in the wake of a global pandemic where thousands died, and now we laugh at all the silly things we did while we were trapped in our homes waiting to see if we would be next on the Grim Reaper's hit list. Unfortunately, you really do have to do some digging and sifting through the mindless shit to unearth those nuggets of wisdom. But hey, at least you can have some fun, such as a life or death battle against a tiger let loose in a casino during the chaos while wading through zombies, awaiting for that plot dump. Strangely enough, Dead Rising 2 got a remake within a few years of its own debut. It was a reinterpretation of the events of the game, but with Frank West as the star. Subtitled Off the Record, it somehow negates the events of the primary title and adds confusion to this plot. But it is considered non-canonical, so you don't have to play it to get the whole story. Unlike the two DLCs this game got, where they actually do expand quite a bit on the plot of the game. Things like this, though, give me pause for concern. If Capcom felt the game could not do well or hold its own in the public view without West as the main character, what can we, the audience, then expect? But in the end of it all, is Dead Rising 2 bad? No, not necessarily. It is certainly not a miserable experience. It is more Dead Rising after all, and that's certainly not bad. And it floats by quite well on the more of the same production value. Yet, in its own way, it is a bummer of an experience because of exactly that more of the same but slightly different attitude, especially when compared to the first game. I can't recommend it compared to the first Dead Rising. But as a standalone product with some well-worn Doc Martens stitched with old Black Flag and agnostic front patches on its digital feet, it walks a decent mile as a new wave semi-rebellious yet pro-corporate zombie game. In the same way most of the post-Romero Dead trilogy films walk a decent mile under the umbrella of stalwart old misplaced and misunderstood social protests of companies bad, climate change bad, but this product is good and not at all like those dirty, harmful products. We've seen its like before in the sort of company-friendly protest social commentary of the modern ambiguous nature of disaffection and dissatisfaction. Not only will the revolution be televised, it will be sponsored by Coca-Cola, Nike, and Nissan. Or at least some sort of whole-body deodorant and testicle shaving device, and possibly a VPN as well. And it is at this point that I jumped off the Dead Rising train. I bought a copy of Dead Rising 3 sometime around 2014 on Steam. It's sat in my library for a literal decade, and I have no desire to play it. I know the player character is some new guy who is a mechanic, but hell if I know more than that. I really did not need another open world zombie slashing game while searching for survivors and stuff and whatever in the abject hell the plot revolves around as had become popular in the 20 teens. I know Dead Rising 4 exists, and so desperate for a hit in the flagging series was Capcom that they put Frank West, now older and somewhat wiser, back in the driver's seat, and I still couldn't give a toss about it. I'd like to play the remake of Dead Rising, mostly because I want to see the quality of life updates they made to it, and it seems, at least from the outside, like it otherwise is exactly the same game as the original, so it cannot be that bad. Too often remakes or reimaginings of games go too far or remove too much. But from a cursory glance, perhaps they did just up the graphics, cleaned up the UI, and made some other back-end changes that have made Dead Rising easier to play. I'm all for that. Yet somehow, despite its company's competing product Resident Evil continuing to get remakes and sequels with a fucking ninth game somewhere on the horizon that I'm sure I'll play and love, Dead Rising is just sort of there. It's the lonely little zombie in the shadow of its hulking juggernaut of a zombified brother. And it really never was able to come out from under that shadow. You see, there comes a point, dear listeners, when smashing undead skulls like overripe melons just fails to satisfy. When the glory kills lose their luster. When the gaming chair becomes a prison, and the only thing a man has is the love for its much bigger and more popular zombie-killing bioterrorism franchise that could. And Dead Rising isn't it. But if you're going to play any of these games, I would say just stick with the original Dead Rising. Sure, it was a glorified tech demo for the Xbox 360's processing power at the time, but even with the bonkers bullshit plot and goofy mechanics and a random level up system where you may either get more health, more inventory space, or a new hand to hand combat move, spin the wheel like a contestant, see what you get, it at least tried for something new and fresh in a tired and rotting entrail sodden field. The first game was my shit. It was a game for me. A younger version of me, that is. Now, not as much. Although there are times I get a little nostalgic hit and desire to revisit a game like it. Its sequel has nowhere near such a pull, and as I said, I really couldn't care less about the games that followed. If you enjoyed them, fantastic. I'm just not with you on that one, and never will be. Which is too bad. But it is the reality of things, and why we have to accept differing opinions about the games we play. I personally think this should have remained a one-off title, a diamond in the rough, lightning in a bottle, to retain a more lasting impact. It was a mistake of Capcom to make this game series a franchise, as it diluted the essence of what made the first game special compared to the family of intellectual properties Capcom owns. But those sequels did come out during the Crapcom and not Cap God period, so maybe such mistakes can be forgiven. It certainly seems they have learned a few things since then. We all have, I hope. Thank you for listening. Deleted Saves would like to thank Brad, Keith Gasper, Orden Wells, and Maslama for being very faithful and beloved patrons of the show. If you'd like to become a patron of the show, please go to patreon.com and check out Deleted Saves podcast. All donations go directly towards maintaining the show itself. Thank you.